All right, let's have someone read for us from the book of Ephesians, chapter 1. We are interested in verse 11. As we go along, we will read several other passages. But Ephesians 1 and verse 11. Maybe you can read more than just that verse. Could you read from verse 3 and go on to verse 13? Ephesians 1, verse 3 to 13. So if you notice verse 11, would you read it again? Verse 11. So we will be reflecting on that, especially the statement, the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His will. We will unpack that and learn ever so many other things. So keep that scripture in mind. If you are familiar with the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which is one of the doctrinal standards of the Presbyterian denomination, and there were various standards drawn up at an assembly that was held at a place called Westminster. So they are referred to as Westminster Standards. And they included the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Larger Catechism, and the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Question 7 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism asks the question, what are the decrees of God? And it gives this answer. The decrees of God are His eternal purpose according to the counsel of His will, whereby for His own glory He hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. Now, that is a definition you would like to memorize. I like to memorize some things. I call them memorizable pieces. And especially the answers given to questions in catechisms, like the Shorter Catechism. Who made you? God. What else did God make? God made everything. Why did God make you and everything? For His own glory. Why did He, what is to glorify God? And so on and so forth. It's a very nice way of learning theology. Well, question 7 poses a question on the decrees of God. And that's the definition. And what I want us to do as we work through that is, first of all, to exegete the definition of a decree. You all understand the meaning of the word exegete. We will exegete that definition, and then we will treat the particular application of that definition towards the doctrine of predestination. That is what we are going to do. So let's begin with the exegesis of the definition of a decree. And when we exegete, we draw out the meaning. That is the literal meaning of the word exegesis. to draw out or to lead out from, to draw out from or to lead out from. So we don't read meaning into, we draw meaning out of. So we've been given the definition, at least in terms of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and let us open it up. And as we do so, we will learn various things about it. The first term that needs pointing out from the definition is the description or the word eternal. Eternal. The decree or decrees of God are his eternal purpose. So that word eternal, what it means and implies is that God's decrees happened in eternity. God's decrees happened in eternity. They didn't happen within the bounds of creation and time. They happened before creation and time. That is the meaning. Then we have the word purpose. Purpose. And the meaning of that word purpose, eternal purpose. So the meaning of the word purpose is plan. Plan. We find the word purpose used here in verse 11 of Ephesians 1 as well. We have been predestined according to the purpose, or if you like, according to the plan of he who works out all things according to the counsel of his will. It's a plan, and it's a plan that was put together before time began, before the creation of the world. The next thing we need to note from the definition is that this plan encompassed whatsoever comes to pass. Okay? It says his eternal decree, his eternal purpose, according to the counsel of his will, whereby for his own glory he has foreordained whatever comes to pass. Okay? He foreordained whatever comes to pass. So everything that's going to happen was determined or planned before they came to pass. Everything that comes to pass was determined before they happened. That's the nature of plans. A plan is the idea of all that you want to see happen. Okay? You think about it before it happens. You draft it before it happens. And God, like an architect, drew this plan. He determined precisely what was going to happen under that plan. So let's take a bit of time to look at this idea of whatsoever comes to pass. Whatsoever comes to pass. Perhaps before we go into the details of that, you will notice that our subject is entitled God's Decree. God's Decree. It is one decree, okay? It's a single decree. It's a single plan from eternity before the creation of the world. And under that one decree, under that single decree, you have various aspects. So because it's a single decree with various aspects, sometimes it is referred to as the decrees of God. It's actually one decree encompassing various subsections. One decree encompassing various subsections. And those various subsections are sometimes referred to as the manifold works of God. In Psalm 104, verse 24, for example, the psalmist exclaims, "O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." Manifold. It's all encompassed under the one plan, but there are many things under that plan. Manifold are your works. So let's look at some of these works that are comprehended under the one decree. First of all, the good actions of people. So the actions that people are going to perform are all comprehended under that plan. Let's have a number of people read for us some verses. Perhaps we can begin with Proverbs chapter 16. Can somebody read that for us? Proverbs 16 verse 4. And then another one, please read Acts chapter 2 verse 23. Proverbs 16 verse 4, just wait. Hang on to that. And then Acts chapter 2 verse 23. And then let's have someone else read Acts chapter 4 verse 27 to 28. And then Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10. Okay, does anybody have Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 4? That verse, among other things, is stressing that he has made even the wicked for a day of destruction. Okay? That is comprehended under the plan of God. The actions of the wicked for which they are destroyed. Okay, Acts chapter 2 verse 23, Jesus Christ was crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. That was in the plan of God. Okay? God ordained that Jesus would be killed at the hands of cruel men, at the hands of lawless men. Chapter 4, verse 27 to 28. Acts chapter 4, 27 to 28. Okay? What is that verse saying about what God has ordained? For truly, against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of God, were gathered together to do what your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. So Herod and Pilate, together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, they all participated in plotting to kill Jesus. But the point being made there is that God purposed all that beforehand. All right? Another evil thing and God purposed it beforehand. What about Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10? Okay? There, he writes about good works. And God prepared these good works beforehand. So both bad works or evil works and good works were comprehended in the plan of God. Okay? Are you with me? Now, I don't think it's a problem for any one of us to accept the fact that God planned the good actions of men. That's not a problem. That's not difficult to accept. But it is difficult to accept that God planned the bad works, the evil actions, the sinful actions of men. So, I want us to delve just a little bit into that and try and understand how God can decree evil actions or sinful actions and still remain holy and still not be the author of sin. Are you with me? If he has decreed evil actions, he has decreed the wicked for a day of destruction. He has decreed that cruel men kill Jesus. And we can speak of other actions as well. How is it possible for God to decree that and yet remain holy on the one hand and not be the author of sin on the other? I think as we respond to this question, we need to be absolutely clear about the fact of God's holiness, which we have already established, haven't we? God is holy, so he is set apart from sin. It is impossible for him to sin. He cannot tolerate sin. He abhors sin. He reacts against sin. He punishes sin. So he cannot have such a nature and at the same time be the author of sin. So there must be some other way of explaining the fact that sin exists. And I want us to read a scripture from Acts chapter 14, verse 16, which says, and this was Paul and Barnabas who were teaching this. It's part of a line from their sermon. And they are speaking about God in verse 16, who they say in bygone days or bygone generations allowed, that's the word Faisal was using, he allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. He allowed. So the decree that relates to sin takes what we may term as a permissive character, okay? God allowed, or we can say God permitted, all right? He allowed, he permitted. And we must distinguish that from an efficient decree, okay? In an efficient decree, God carries it out himself. For example, he decreed to create, and he himself created. He decreed to save, and he himself saves directly by his own effective energy. But when it comes to sinful actions, he also decrees them. But they are going to come to pass through secondary causes that will be completely responsible for these actions. Because when they perform the actions, they are not going to be forced to perform the actions. They have been allowed to make the choice and to carry out the actions out of their own effective energy. So as secondary causes, they will make the choice, they will perform the action, and they will be completely responsible for those actions. That is what a permissive decree looks like. Sin or sinful actions take that permissive character. Just a follow-up question on that. Is the permissive decree a bare inactive permitting of evil? Is the permissive decree a bare inactive permitting of evil? And the answer to that question is no. It's not a bare inactive permission. A permissive decree determines the event of the evil being permitted. In other words, it does make certain that the event is going to happen. It will happen. It is a certainty. It will happen. But it's going to happen through secondary causes that will make the choice to do that action, will want to do that action, and will carry out that action. But because God decreed it and guarantees the performance of that action, God overrules the action to a good end, okay? Ultimately, as we shall see in a moment, his decree are meant to glorify him. His decree is meant to carry out his purposes for his own glory. So if the decreed event is of a sinful character, God doesn't effectively bring it to pass. He allows secondary causes to do it, but overrules the action in such a way that it will bring about a good end, contrary to the intentions of both the work and the worker of that action. God will bring it to a good end. Now, we can illustrate this principle, first of all, from Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. This is a verse many of us use. God works out all things for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. So those who are called, the people of God, may be going through a bad experience, an evil experience. They may be going through that. And it's a painful experience. But God uses it for their good. God uses it for a good end. An actual illustration of that could be seen in the experience of Joseph. Now, do you remember Joseph? Joseph was one of the children of Jacob. He was a favored child. So, because he was a favored child, the other brothers did not like it. They actually hated Joseph for being Jacob's favored child. And because of their hatred, they ended up selling him into Egypt. And they particularly sold him to an Egyptian official called Potiphar, who threw him into prison. And of course, he suffered all manner of mistreatment because Potiphar ended up selling him as a slave. Now, it's interesting to see how Joseph interprets that situation from Genesis chapter 45 rather, verse 5 to 8, and chapter 50, verse 20. Maybe we should look at those verses, because then you will see how that although wicked men were allowed to mistreat Joseph, his own brothers were allowed to sell him to Potiphar, who ended up selling him into slavery. Yet God overruled and brought it to a good end. So someone please read Genesis 45, verse 5 to 8, and then another one, you can read Genesis 50, verse 20. What is he saying? Those are the words of Joseph. So in other words, the the brothers meant it for ill. Okay, they thought evil against Joseph. But then he goes on to say, but God meant it for good. So the very evil that the brothers planned and carried out, it is God who allowed it. They meant to harm Joseph, but God meant to use it not just for Joseph's good, but for the good of his own brothers and for the good of the people of God at large. Do you see that point? The brothers meant it for evil, but the same thing that the brothers meant for evil, God meant it for good. Okay, let's read chapter 50, verse 20. You meant evil against me, but God meant good. It's God who planned it. The plan took a permissive character. So God allowed it. Those who carried it out were the secondary causes. They wanted to do evil, they desired to do evil, and they carried out evil. But God overruled those actions to bring good out of it. So this holy God, therefore, is not authoring evil. He is permitting secondary causes to carry out the evil, but he uses those actions unto a good end. God himself can't be the author of sin, and he can't be the author of sin because sin is contrary to his holy nature, and it is also contrary to his law. Are you with me? Okay, let's take it a little further and look at how theologians have interacted with this matter and debated it among themselves. And we are going to look at a debate that is known as the Lapsarian debate. Ever heard of that? The Lapsarian debate? What do you know about the Lapsarian debate? Rather than say the logical precedence, perhaps you could say the logical order, the order of the decrees. Now, some of the decrees are not necessarily in a logical order. So perhaps it's best to simply say the order of the decrees. So how the decrees are ordered can indicate whether God is the author of sin or not. That's really what the debate was about. And it was a debate between two groups of people. The one group referred to as supralapsarians, and the other group were referred to as infralapsarians. Now, you will find Calvinistic supralapsarians and Calvinistic infralapsarians. You also will find and Arminian infralapsarians. What would you understand by those terms? Supralapsarianism and infralapsarianism. So what is being debated here is the relationship between the decree to elect and the decree to allow the fall. Okay? The decree to elect and the decree to allow the fall. The fall, to use a Latin word, is the lapse. To fall is to lapse. Okay? Now, does election come before the fall, before the lapse, or does it come after the lapse? Does election come above the lapse, or does it come below the lapse? Supra-lapse believe that election comes before the lapse. Infra means it comes below the lapse or after the lapse. Okay? Now, why is this significant? Let's look at the way supralapsarians would order the decrees and then compare it to the way infralapsarians order it. And we'll see which system of ordering the decrees is open to the charge of making God the author of sin. Okay, let's begin with the supralapsarian scheme. Within the supralapsarian camp, you come across the high supralapsarians and the low supralapsarians. Let me talk about the high supralapsarians. This is how they order the decree. They say, first, the decree to elect and to reprobate comes first. Okay? So God first decided to allow, in other words, he decided to decree people to be elected and also to be consigned to hell. That's the first thing God decrees. Then he decrees to create all humanity. That is followed by the decree to ordain the four, and then the decree to provide salvation in Christ for the elect, and 5, the decree to apply salvation to the elect through the Holy Spirit. So God first decrees those who will be elected and those who will go to hell. Only after he has decreed election and reprobation does he decree the creation, the four, salvation, and application of that salvation. That's supralapsarianism. On the other hand, the infralapsarian scheme, let's call it the hard infralapsarianism. This is how it goes. First, the decree to create all humanity. Second, the decree to ordain the four. And third, the decree to elect and reprobate. And then fourth, the decree to provide salvation. And 5, the decree to apply the salvation. The infralapsarian scheme is a more logical scheme. First, God decrees to create, and then from those that he creates, he decrees to allow the fall, and then from those who fall, he decrees to elect and to reprobate, and then he decrees to provide salvation in Christ, and then he decrees to apply salvation to the elect. Now, if you look at these two schemes, which one do you think is open to the charge that they make God the author of sin? Now, you have to follow what we are saying to be able to offer an opinion on it. Did you hear the way supralapsarians order their decrees and the way the infras order their decrees? James is saying the infralapsarian order opens God to, opens supralapsarians to the charge of making God the author of sin. And the reasoning for that is that he ordains election and reprobation before the fall. So before people fall, they are already ordained to go to hell, for example, which means that they can't avoid sinning so that they can go to the place that God has already ordained for them to go. Are there any contrary views to that? Or you agree with James? Yeah, I think the point is how the decrees are ordered will point to whether God actually rigs people into sinning so that they can fit into his plan to have them go to hell. Look at this supralapsarian outlook. God orders or decrees people to be elected or reprobated first. That's the first thing that comes to mind. So because that is the first thing he plans, everything else that follows needs to fit into that plan. So if he has elected people for salvation and people for reprobation, the fall comes so that it fits into the idea of people going to hell as per God's predetermination. Okay? So God is open to the charge of authoring sin because the first thing he wants is to create hell, if I may put it that way, and then to go on and ordain people to sin so that they can go to hell. Do you see the point? That's the way it's conceived. I'm not saying that's how supralapsarians were thinking. But when you look at the way they order the decree, that is what it appears like. If you look at the supralapsarian arguments, the way they defend their argument, what they are saying is that they want to cast the grace of God in the forefront, you know, before they think about anything else. God decreed to elect people first, before he even creates them, before he even allows the fall. Okay? So they think that this is the best way of magnifying the grace of God. The infralapsarians would argue, but no, because it comes first, you know, election and reprobation, especially reprobation, comes first. It's not the grace of God you are magnifying. It is the cruelty of God you are magnifying. You know, he orders that people be bypassed and they will go to hell first, and then he ordains that they fall into sin so that they can actually be bypassed and sent to hell. That's not a magnification of grace. It's a magnification of the cruelty of God. So they propose rather, and if you look at the infralapsarian scheme, it's logical. And when you follow the logical path, in God's decree, the fall comes at the right time. And the people who fall become responsible for their own sin and not God. So here is the logical plan for the infralapsarians. God first decrees to elect, to create people. So in his mind, they will be created first. And then secondly, he decrees to permit them to fall. So when he creates them upright. He doesn't create them fallen. He creates them upright. And then he permits them to fall. Only after permitting them to fall, and they fall, does he decree to elect some from them and to bypass others. And once he has elected some and bypassed others, he then decrees salvation. And then he decrees the application of that salvation. So according to the infralapsarian scheme, if you follow the logical order of the decrees, there is no need to think that God could possibly have authored sin. He decreed to create them and only permitted them to fall. And from those who fell, he exercises his grace by electing some. So they think that's a better way of protecting God against the charge of being the author of sin. Whether the infralapsarian scheme succeeds at protecting God is debatable. To my mind, it's probably a better way of accounting for things than the way the supralapsarians put it. No, we did say he decreed. He decreed sin, and that makes it a certainty. You remember me saying that? However, the decree takes a permissive character rather than an efficient character. Okay? He decreed it, it will therefore come to pass, but the manner in which it will come to pass is that the secondary cause will make the choice. Okay? So he allows the secondary cause to make the choice to sin. It doesn't make him the author of sin. It does make him plan for some higher end or higher purpose, but the plan is such that the sin will come about through a secondary cause, i.e., Satan is going to originate it. Okay? And two, Adam is going to be attracted to it. And he's going to choose to do it. And because Adam is representing the human race, that sin will then be transferred to the human race. So yes, God decreed it, and that makes it a certainty. But how, in fact, it is brought about will be through secondary causes, who are also comprehended in that decree. When people use the word author, they mean that God actually makes people sin, okay? Which he doesn't. He decrees, he plans that it's going to happen. But how it will come about, how it will be done, will be executed through secondary causes. These secondary causes will be free agents. So they are going to make a choice to do it and will be responsible for it. That's the way to view it. No, he's not the one doing the action. He's the one planning. Yeah, he's responsible for the plan. The plan includes the fact that secondary agents will originate the sin and carry out the sin, and will be responsible for that. The fact that he planned it makes it a certainty. But the plan is such that he will not carry out the sin, okay? The secondary free agents will. If those agents were acting like robots, you can say that God programmed them to do his bidding. Well, he doesn't program them. He creates them as free agents. So they make a choice to sin. And because they made a choice freely and they wanted to do it, they are completely responsible for the action. Yes, we have already read Joseph and his experience with his brothers. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So God is involved in that action in the sense that he planned it. But it's Joseph's brothers who mooted the plan, executed the plan, were responsible for the plan. Do you see the point? So that's one example. Another example is Judas Iscariot. He betrayed the Lord. But that is also what God had ordained. So God ordained it, but Judas Iscariot was completely responsible for it. There's a line of mystery there, and we can't completely explain that mystery. But that's the way it works. God planned it for a very good purpose, but it's Judas Iscariot who decided to betray his Lord, who carried out that decision, and who was responsible for it. if he wasn't responsible, why did he commit suicide? Why did he not ask God, rather, to kill himself? He took responsibility for it because he was responsible for it. James, you had your hand up. The plan is made in eternity. It's meant to be executed in time. And I cannot imagine that it will not be logical in the mind of a God whose reasoning is perfect. I think that it should be logical. Does logic there mean the infralapsarian order? Well, to my mind, it seems like that's what makes more sense. And that is probably how it featured in God's own mind. But I could be wrong. I expect God to be logical. I may not understand God's logic, but I expect it to be logical, nonetheless. Yeah, it matters because the debate was about whether God is the author of sin or not. So how he orders the decrees, or how the decrees feature in the mind of God, could open him to the charge or absorb him of the charge. So for those who were debating the matter, it was important to look at the order. And the supralapsarian scheme appears to open God to that charge, even though in their own mind, they didn't see it that way. Their intention was to exalt the grace of God by starting with a decree that actually is about the grace of God. The infralapsarians didn't see it that way. They think grace of God will still appear, but in the right order, not where the supralapsarians put it. So it's an important discussion. Okay, we've been discussing this under the fact that in terms of the things God planned, he included good actions as well as evil actions. And this is what we've been discussing. The plan of God also includes events that are contingent from a human perspective. They include means and ends of actions. We'll go into some detail about this later on. For example, if God has planned the salvation of people, he also has planned the means through which they will experience that salvation. So he doesn't just plan the end, he also plans the means to those ends. The plan includes the length and place of a person's life, how long they will live for, where they are going to live, how they are going to die. All of that is comprehended in the plan of God. And of course, you are familiar with the fact that even apparently small things, like hair falling off from your head, is decreed by God. From our perspective as humans, it doesn't appear such an important thing. It doesn't appear such a momentous thing. But in God's way of looking at things, they are very important. So everything is comprehended in the plan. There is a third thing I want us to observe from the definition, and it is that the plan is God's. He makes it without influence from outsiders. Okay? He makes it without influence from outsiders. Because Ephesians 1 verse 11 says, he does it according to the counsel of his will. Okay? According to the counsel of his will. His own will counseled him to make this plan and this plan and this plan. No one else contributed to that counsel. His own will counseled him. And this, of course, is important considering what we have already learned when we were looking at the self-sufficiency of God. Is God's knowledge sufficient? Is God's counsel sufficient? Or it is insufficient and inadequate, and he therefore will need input from outsiders? You may have come across people who suggest that angels were also, inputting into the plan of God. How could they do that? If the plan was in eternity, before time began, angels could not have been there before their own time started. Angels are creatures of time. They are not eternal like God. Their existence had a beginning. God's existence does not have a beginning. He is sufficient. His counsel is sufficient. So he didn't need input from anyone else, from anywhere else. The last bit about the definition is that it was intended for God's glory. It was intended for God's glory. How does Ephesians 1 verse 11 put it? It's for his own glory. He works all things out according to the counsel of his will, according to his pleasure, or for his own glory. So the chief end of God's decree is his own glory. It is for the purpose of displaying his majesty, his praise, his own glory. Now that is very important to appreciate. Sometimes when we are thinking about such mysterious doctrines, we can tend to focus on a secondary cause who chooses to sin, because God planned that they will choose to sin. So we get bogged down with that and fall short of seeing the end result, what it is God is trying to achieve through this. I think I have spoken here about the fall of Adam. Was the fall of Adam planned? Was it the will of God that Adam falls? And we have to answer that yes, it was the will of God. God decreed it. But it was a decree of a permissive character. Adam will choose to sin, Adam will choose to follow the evil one. And so he will fall, he will become a sinner. And we can get stuck right there and start arguing about how can a holy God allow the fall of man? How can a holy God allow the fall of humanity? How can a holy God do that? We get stuck. And we mustn't get stuck. We mustn't forget about the purpose. He wants to glorify himself. And we've already seen that God glorifies himself through creation, through providence, but chiefly through redemption. If there would be a redemption at all, there must be a fall. The fall will trigger the coming of Christ, who will do a work that pleases God above everything else, and a work, therefore, that will glorify God in a way that nothing else can. So we have to see beyond those, let's call them warring things, okay? How can God decree sin? Doesn't this make him the author of sin? It's a good debate to have. But we mustn't end at that. We must go on to see the glory that will follow when God begins to repair the fall and its effects through his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Yeah, God is free to plan what he wishes to plan. And God freely planned to allow the fall of man. God freely plans to permit men to sin. He doesn't author the sin, but he allows them to conceive it, to live it out. And he allows them the freedom so that they can also take responsibility for it. The difficulty often is trying to reconcile the fact that he can plan but not be the author. Well, in his freedom, he decrees in such a way, in other words, he plans in such a way that the secondary cause will both originate the sin, play out the sin, and take responsibility. In the end, he is going to give an account before God. Now you can see how senseless it would be if God was the author of sin. He also makes himself a judge of the very sin that he has authored. Won't make sense. He plans it, so it's going to be a certainty. But he plans to allow secondary causes, through the freedom of their will, to choose to sin and to take responsibility for that action. And yes, to give an account to God for the action. So God freely decrees. And the secondary causes freely choose to carry out the sin. No, he's not the author of sin in what he freely decrees. He decrees freely that the secondary cause will author the sin. Yeah.